Hello Queens and Trainings, welcome back to another QT session. I'm Soleil, and if you were here last time, you may remember me talking about my favorite queen, Queen Jenga. But I just couldn't leave Africa without talking about one of the most iconic divas to ever rule. But before we get into that, we have to get ready. Can you guess who it is yet? We're doing Queen Cleopatra. So buckle up, Nessus, because this story has everything from drama to action to romance to even a bit of mystery. Dun dun dun! This story is going to be magnificent. Today we're going back to 51 BC, where Cleopatra is living in the royal palace in Alexandria. She lives with her sister Arsinoe and her two brothers, Ptolemy the 13th and Ptolemy the 14th. They all live with the pharaoh, their father, Ptolemy the 12th. They weren't very iconic or original with these names, but I'll keep it to myself. Unfortunately, they were not a very happy family. As a matter of fact, Cleopatra did have an older sister, but her dad had her because she tried to take over the country, which means she tried to take the throne. Yeah, talk about corporal punishment at its worst. What a sister. While all the children of the pharaoh lived in the royal palace, they were raised by different people, meaning they were taught different skills and different things. So there wasn't a lot of sibling love floating through the air. But Cleopatra was different from her siblings. She didn't only inspire to be good at politics. She was also an amazing scholar, linguist, scientist, and historian. Also, connecting with the people of Egypt was very important to her. Now, a bit of backstory. The Ptolemies didn't originate in Egypt. They were actually from Macedonia. They were put into power when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt from the Persians about 300 years before that and made it a Roman province. Unfortunately, the Ptolemies refused to learn anything about the native Egyptians. Think about it like this. So one day you're just on your couch and you're eating some Lay's chips, right? And then boom, these men come into your house and you're like, huh? And they're all like, what? You try to communicate with them, but they refuse to learn anything about you or your family. And there's nothing you can do about it. Obviously, this has never happened to me, but if it did, I think I'd have a problem with it. Obviously, back then there was nothing they could do about it, so if it were to happen to me, now maybe I could do something about it, but back then I don't think I would be able to. But Cleopatra was known for her desire to learn, and to especially learn about the people of Egypt, not just the natives. And everyone loved and respected her for it, especially her dad. Oh, and by the way, about the random dog that just popped in the frame. This is a pharaoh. You get it? You get it? Yeah. It's still 51 BC, and the pharaoh, not that pharaoh, the pharaoh is dying. In the middle of him dying, he tells Cleopatra to not trust anyone. Now, remember that power vacuum we talked about last video? Well, QTs, it's happening again. But the pharaoh, he had a plan. In his will, he named Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra as rulers together. Though this wouldn't eliminate competition and bloodshed between siblings. So Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra agreed to get married to each other. To be fair, the ancient Egyptians didn't really look at the pharaohs as humans. They more so looked at them as gods. They practiced polytheism, or the belief in many gods. While these deities were siblings, they did marry each other. The ruling god and goddess was the siblings Osiris and Isis, who were also married. Although it sounds gross to us now, it wasn't looked at as bad back then since they were gods.
So, Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 13th get married, yada yada, have their wedding in the city of Memphis. But this did not stop the siblings from fighting. You see, Ptolemy the 13th had an advisor named Pothinus, who basically raised him. If you remember, we talked about it earlier. Basically, Pothinus wanted to rule, but Cleopatra was in the way. And he gets a group of allies and forces Cleopatra and Arsene away to flee.
Cleopatra ends up running to the North Egypt where there are people who are loyal to her father. She stays there for about 2 years before leaving to go to Syria. While she's there, she begins building an army largely made up of Egyptians and Syrians.
Remember how we said Egypt was made a province of Rome by Alexander the Great? Well,
historically, Egypt was a rich country because the Nile River would flood every year, making the surrounding soil very fertile. It was so rich that Egypt was considered the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. But the river had not flooded as much over the previous years. So, Cleopatra's father had borrowed a lot of money from the Romans, specifically a man named Pompey. At this time, Rome was in the middle of a civil war, one side being led by Pompey and the other by the one and only Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar defeats Pompey's army, Pompey flees to Egypt, where he thinks he has allies. Sadly, the thumbtack but Pothinus has the grand idea to send men to assassinate Pompey. Daddy said everybody ain't your friend. Poor Pompey, he learned the hard way. The thought process was that if Pompey died, then the debt would die with him, and they'd be in Caesar's good graces. But there was a problem. Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt, and when he arrived at the palace in Alexandria, Ptolemy the 13th presented Pompey's head on a silver platter. This made Caesar fume. First of all, even though Caesar and Pompey were fighting, Pompey was Caesar's son-in-law. Second of all, the Roman sense of honor had been violated. He wasn't killed in the battle, he was more so stabbed in the back. Side note, QTs never, and I mean never, get in the middle of family fights. It never ends well. But word got to Cleopatra that Caesar was in Egypt, so she got ready to go sneak back into the royal palace. And here, my future pharaohs, is where the mystery begins for this lovely queen. Because no one could understand or figure out how she did it. Anyway, Cleopatra got her audience, and Caesar was totally taken aback, and he really liked her. Well, I mean, she was nothing like he was used to. She was beautiful, she was brave, she was confident, and she was very, very intelligent. She had the confidence of a goddess, and to her she was. I mean, the women that were in Rome weren't brought into conversations about politics or strategies, and the men were seen as superior. And here was a woman that bowed to no one, exiled or not. They ended up staying up all night and talking. Cleopatra got Caesar to agree to 3 things. 1. He reinstated Cleopatra as co-ruler of Egypt. 2. He sends Arsene away. He sends Arsene away to Cyprus. And 3, he reduces the debt that Egypt owes to Rome. Now, Pothinus and Ptolemy are stewing, and there was not a lot of peace left. Not a lot of peace to the point that an entire war breaks out. The Alexandrian Wars was a civil war in Egypt. On one side, you have Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. On the other side, you have Ptolemy the 13th and Arsinoe. Then Cleopatra learns that, girl, she is pregnant by none other than Julius Caesar. This is a crazy ace in the game. This baby is literally the key to unite two of the greatest civilizations in the world. Matter of fact, Arsinoe and Ptolemy lose the battle because, Ptolemy was wearing gold armor when he fell overboard and drowned. But Arsinoe is captured and taken back to the palace, and Cleopatra makes Caesar promise that he will take her back to Rome and have her. Dun dun dun! Okay, so it's 46 BC and Cleopatra is about 22 years old. Now she has given birth to a healthy baby boy named Caesarion. The baby boy is the love child of two of the greatest rulers in the world. Ptolemy the 13th, her brother, husband, and enemy, is now dead, and Arsinoe is on her way to be executed in Rome. But if you remember, there needs to be two pharaohs to represent Osiris and Isis. So Cleopatra has to marry her younger brother, Ptolemy the 14th. Everything's going good in the kingdom See, when Caesar arrives in Rome, the citizens are outraged. They could not believe that he could treat a young, helpless girl like this. And then he plans to kill her. To them, the idea was ludicrous. To be fair, Arsinoe was only 17 at the time, and the Romans had no idea what she was capable of. So he had an idea. He ended up locking her away in Ephesus, where the country is Turkey now. When Caesarion is about a year old, Cleopatra takes him to Rome with one goal: for Caesar to publicly claim him. When Cleopatra arrived, she stayed in one of Caesar's villas, and the Romans did not like her a lot. And I mean, the reasons were because she was, sophisticated, beautiful, intelligent, and even worse, she was confident. Oh my God, the nerve. Side note, one senator even wrote that she was insolent and arrogant. But seriously, Rome was founded by soldiers and farmers, and Cleopatra's family had been ruling a thriving nation for over 3 centuries. Roman women had barely any rights, unlike the women in Egypt. But, Cleopatra could talk circles around these men. When Cleopatra arrives, Caesar sends in a request and is named Dictator of Rome. He builds a library and listens to Cleopatra's ideas about architecture. When it's finished, it looks like the library that was burnt down in Alexandria that Cleopatra loved. He also adopted the solar-based calendar. Fun fact: it's the same calendar that we use today. The Roman elites go absolutely crazy. I mean, she had opinions. And the worst part about it is Caesar was actually listening to them. And who cares if she was a scientist? Nope, she must have casted a spell on him. And if Rome didn't do anything about this, they'd be the servant to Egypt and its witch of a queen. They couldn't deny that Cleopatra definitely had an influence on Caesar and Rome. But anyway, Cleopatra had to leave Rome to go back to Egypt to look after Egypt. But Caesar still did not recognize Caesarion as his son. It's 44 BC, and Caesar is named dictator for life. This was the last straw for the statesmen. They looked at it in their minds as Cleopatra just made him the king to her. It's March 15th, 44 BC, and Caesar, he's assassinated and stabbed many times. Dun, dun, dun! When Cleopatra hears the news, she is absolutely devastated. As a person, she's heartbroken, but as a queen, she is worried. She had just lost what could give her the best security in her kingdom. So, with no other choice really, she leaves. Remember how Caesar had locked Arsinoe up in a prison? Well, now that he was dead, Arsinoe ends up allying with the governor of Cyprus, and she ends up getting out. Well, now that she was out, she meets up and teams up with Ptolemy the 14th, Cleopatra's husband, but he shortly falls ill and ends up dying. Rumor has it that Cleopatra may have even had her brother, husband, killed. Allegedly. This is where Octavian comes into play. Well, Octavian was Caesar's great nephew and was the only one written in his will to be the only heir. Him and a guy named Mark Antony team up and end up killing the people that assassinated Caesar. During this conflict, Mark Antony hears that Cleopatra is helping the assassins. He begins summoning Cleopatra to meet him to determine why Cleopatra is like, "Sir, I am a goddess. Who are you talking to?" You see, Antony was a precise little thing. I mean, he kept asking Cleopatra to meet up at Tarsus so they could have a conversation. I mean, she eventually said yes, and they ended up meeting up. One of the reasons she agreed was because he could get Caesarion recognized as Caesar's only son. So Cleopatra sails to Tarsus, but baby, when I say Queen Cleo shows up and shows out, she has the most lavish ships, the finest clothes, and the personality to match. She shows everyone that she is in fact a goddess. When she arrives, Antony goes to her ship to get answers, and surprise, surprise, it wasn't Cleopatra helping the assassinators. It was none other than Arsinoe. So they create an alliance to kill her and the assassins. Once Arsinoe and the assassins are killed, Cleopatra invites Antony to Alexandria. While he's gone, in Rome, Octavian begins to spread rumors about how Antony was put under a wicked spell, and bewitched by the witch Cleopatra. And obviously, Antony wasn't there in Rome to deny any of the rumors. He doesn't want to go back to Rome, but Cleopatra says that he needs to go back. Giving birth back then was seen as a death sentence, And being that Cleopatra not only gave birth to Sarian, but also gave birth to two healthy twins, was proof that she was really ISIS. Once Antony leaves Rome, he turns around and goes and marries Octavian's sister, Octavia. Whatever. But Cleopatra, being the diva she is, she was very mindful, very classy, very demure. And she understood for political reasons and didn't care all that much. But at the same time, in Egypt times, it wasn't seen as that big of a deal when a woman gives birth without a husband. The worst part about it was that Antony ignored Cleopatra for 3 years. I mean, not even a letter, a pigeon, a smoke signal, not even a bat signal. Nothing. He flat out ghosted the Queen of Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and the ruling goddess of Egypt. But Cleopatra was a true diva. She didn't wait around for Antony to stop being stupid. Like Glorilla said, if you don't want to be kept, don't keep them. And she's not just sitting on her butt or nothing. She's making sure the whole kingdom is getting that money. And Egypt is literally a self-sustaining powerhouse now. As you can imagine, a city largely founded by soldiers and military capability was much celebrated in Rome. Turns out, Antony thought that if he married Octavian would support him. Wasn't the case. Stuck in a war with a powerful country but no resources, Antony goes back to Cleopatra and wants to meet up. Cleopatra agrees, but before they meet up, she demands all of her Egyptian territories returned to her. And Caesarion recognized as Caesar's son. Antony agrees, and Cleopatra gives him the ships and soldiers. Antony finally comes to Alexandria and meets his kids. Stops being a deadbeat. But there is no doubt that he loves his kids. He names one of them Alexander Helios and the other Cleopatra Selene, the sun and moon. After some time, Cleopatra becomes pregnant again. Sadly, one of Antony's allies betrays him and he loses the campaign with Parthia. Cleopatra did not accompany him on this battle because she was in labor with their third kid named after Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy. News gets to Rome and they call him inefficient.
Ooh, bird.
Depressed and embarrassed, Antony goes to Syria. Cleopatra motivates him to take the fight to Octavia and claim what is rightfully his. Invigorated, Antony divorces Octavia, marries Cleopatra, formally hands over all the territories Cleopatra wanted, and claims Caesarion. Octavian is so mad, I imagine him sitting there with steam coming out of his ears. He starts to push the anti-Rome propaganda throughout the city, but he doesn't blame Antony. Nope, he formally declares war on Cleopatra. This officially is the start of decades-long war between Rome and Egypt. The Battle of Actium takes place in 31 BC. And we're talking about warrior queens, so of course Cleopatra was on the front lines. But Antony's generals didn't like taking orders from a woman. Ignore the fact that she paid for everything, gave 200 ships, and was a woman with battle experience. Most of them left to join Octavian's army. Once the battle begins, Cleopatra and Antony command separate ships. Mark Antony in the front and Cleo in the back. They try to break Octavian's blockade at the Bay of Actium since they have fewer ships but more firepower. Unfortunately, Octavian's ships are faster and he surrounds most of Cleopatra and Antony's ships. Seeing the battle was lost, Cleopatra turned her remaining ships around and sailed back to Alexandria. The Romans saw this as treason, but Cleopatra's primary goal was the protection of Egypt, and with no ships, Egypt would be left completely defenseless. In other words, it's better to live to fight another day. Antony is obviously upset, but Cleopatra refuses to apologize. She realizes that this is the beginning to her end. She ends up writing to Octavian asking if her and Antony can live. He writes back stating that he will grant her request under one condition. She has to kill Antony, or if she doesn't, then her and her kids will die. Dun, dun, dun! Once they get back to Alexandria, Antony falls into a depression again. Cleopatra loses faith in him. But she ends up sending the kids away with trusted people. She knows as long as they're okay, that Egypt has a chance. Octavian sends the largest army ever seen to invade Egypt. They march by land in order to gain any of Antony's remaining allies. Antony is still losing men to Octavian's army, both Egyptian and Roman. I guess nobody really liked him, me included. The two armies end up meeting right outside of Alexandria. Antony's army ends up winning, but not without a couple losses. Although nervous, Cleopatra sends him out to the next battle. When Antony starts to lose, he offers gold to Octavian's soldiers. Although this has the opposite effect. More of Antony's soldiers begins to go to Octavian's army. Now Cleopatra knew the walls surrounding the palace were well guarded, or so she thought. So when she saw the Romans climbing the walls, she officially knew that they had lost the battle. Cleopatra locked herself and all of her gold inside her tomb where Antony finds her. He ended up trying to commit suicide, but he wanted to die with Cleopatra, and so he dies in her arms. Even though it's clear that Octavian has won the war, he doesn't want Cleopatra killed by the Romans. Instead, he wants to parade her through the streets. When the Romans find her in her tomb, they take her back to Alexandria, and where she finds out that her kids have been captured. Although most people would have a mental breakdown or freak out, she remains very classy, very mindful, very demure, and most of all, very defiant. While a prisoner in Alexandria, Cleopatra takes a poison that she knows will be painless and will not destroy her body in any way. Most people believe it was from an Egyptian asp, the symbol of Egyptian royalty. Before Cleopatra died and took the poison, she requested that one, her and Mark Antony be buried together, and two, her kids inherit Egypt. There was no evidence that Mark Antony and Cleopatra were buried together, and two, they were buried at all. But most believe that they were probably cremated since that was custom in Rome. After the triumph in Rome, Octavian sends the kids to go live with Octavia. Yeah, remember Antony's ex-wife? Well, anyway, Octavian is elevated to Emperor of Rome, and even more to a god. Yeah, the same thing they hated Cleopatra for, they turn around and do the same thing. Unfortunately for Egypt, Rome ends up draining out all the wealth and resources that were once a thriving nation. They literally pulled the plug out of a tub and let all the stuff drain out from a whole country. There are really no accounts about what happens to the remaining sons of Cleopatra, but Miss Cleopatra Selene, she goes on to marry Juba of Mauritania, where she becomes queen. Her court is filled with literature, philosophy, and art from Mauritania and Egypt. She has a son whose name is Ptolemy, who goes on to be a king. And then her granddaughter later gets married into the Roman imperial family. So it's through Selene that Cleopatra's dynasty and legacy survives. I love how smart and strategic Cleopatra was. I love how she never faltered in her confidence, even when an entire country hated her, except for me. Although she is mostly portrayed with Western European features, she was indeed Egyptian. We see it in her unbreakable bond with the country and with her people. It's actually her mixed heritage that I think so many people can connect with her. That so many people can envision that she looked like them. It's the mystery behind that she draws people to her story. Unfortunately, Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her death marked the end of one of the world's greatest civilizations. Well, cuties, this story did not end the way I wanted it to. I made justice for my man Caesar. I think she would have been better off if she would have just Mark Antony, because if you think about it, her and all of her kids would have lived. My God, should have had me back then. Though, if you think about it, Queen Cleopatra's legacy lived on through Selene. And let's talk about how Selene was more than a princess. She was a queen in training. A QT even. Shop at Soleil's Boutique. Now, ancient Rome sucks. They literally tarnished her name and reputation all because their heroes loved her. They were completely jealous of her. After she died, they literally elevated Octavian as a god. Anyway, Cleopatra's story is a legend. It has influenced some of the greatest writers and storytellers of all time. She was a mother, a friend, and queen in the truest sense of the word. Well, cuties, thank you for sitting through another QT session with me. Stay tuned because next week we will be talking about Queen Amani-Reines. I would like to thank my beautiful puppy, Pharaoh, and my camera girl from the second time, Angel. She was from my Queen and Jenga video, and if you haven't watched that, get on and go watch it. If you have any comments or suggestions about the next queen we should do, please drop them down below. Don't forget to like and share.